Washington, D.C. Bureau. It's good to be with you. Thank you for joining us. Here's a look at some of the stories that we're watching right now.
Mr. President, you have a great deal to lose. And I began to explain to him what he had to lose, and what the country had to lose, and what the department had to lose. And this was not in anyone's best interest.
The House committee investigating the deadly January 6th riot at the Capitol wraps up its 5th day of hearings. Today's focus, detailing a pressure campaign on the Justice Department to overturn the 2020 presidential election by former President Donald Trump and his associates. Previously, former Attorney General William Barr characterized Trump's electoral fraud allegations as, quote, detached from reality. And with a dozen Republican senators joining their Democratic colleagues, a gun control bill could be passed as early as this week. It would provide some $15 billion to states to enforce so-called red flag laws. Timing depends on whether or not senators can agree on cutting short debate time. And the Supreme Court says it's a constitutional right of all Americans to carry a handgun outside their homes, overturning a New York law which had required a special permit. The ruling comes ahead of the High Court's decision on whether or not the right to an abortion will be protected by federal law and government, or for the states to decide. And Chief Pete Arredondo, head of the Uvalde School District Police Force, has been put on leave weeks after the mass murder of students and teachers at Robb Elementary School. His refusal to order the officers into the besieged school until almost an hour and a half after the first shots were fired, has been at the center of several failures outlined by the Texas Department of Public Safety. And later this hour, the fate of Democratic efforts to shake up the 2024 primary calendar in the Midwest may ultimately fall in Republican hands. We'll explain why it matters and what's at stake. We begin tonight with Day 5 of the January 6th committee hearings. Today's hearings focused on former President Trump's efforts to influence the Justice Department over the 2020 election results. We heard from 3 Justice Department officials who were in charge in the final days of the Trump presidency and on the day of the Capitol riot. Former Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen testified. He was almost replaced by Mr. Trump just days before the Capitol riot with a department official who championed election fraud claims. The former acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue and Stephen Engel, who led the DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel, also testified. Here's Rosen on the president's push to influence the department.
A common element of all of this was the president expressing his dissatisfaction that the Justice Department, in his view, had not done enough to investigate election fraud.
Jeff Clark was proposing that Jeff Rosen be replaced by Jeff Clark. And I thought the proposal was asinine.
I do recall saying to people that somebody should be put in charge of the Justice Department who isn't frightened of what's going to be done to their reputation.
I felt in that conversation that it was incumbent on me to make it very clear to the president what our investigations had revealed, and that we had concluded, based on actual investigations, actual witness interviews, actual reviews of documents, that these allegations simply had no merit.
As I alluded to earlier, the issue really wasn't about me. It would have been fine, as I said, to have had Rich Donahue replace me. I would have said, great, I get 17 days vacation or something. But the issue was the use of the Justice Department. And it's just so important that the Justice Department adhere to the facts and the law.
So for more on this, let's bring in Robert Costa and Siobhan Hughes. Robert is CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent, and Siobhan covers Capitol Hill for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you both for being here on this big day. Bob, I want to start with you. Since you've been covering every minute of these hearings, it was striking to hear from 3 members of the Justice Department, all of whom served in the Trump administration, under oath, testifying about this pressure campaign from the then president to have them essentially meddle in the 2020 election results. What was the biggest takeaway that you learned from today's testimony?
The big takeaway was that big moment, January 3rd, 2021, the culmination of Trump's pressure campaign on the Justice Department. In the Oval Office, several Department of Justice officials telling the president that he will face mass resignations if he continues to lean on the Justice Department and try to get them to buy into his false claims about the election, to sign a letter and send a letter to Georgia, to call a special session to try to send so-called alternate electors to Washington to be counted on January 6th. What we see is that January 3rd meeting really put into motion in a new way what happened just days later on January 6th. It was a trigger scene in American history because just a day later on January 4th, Trump starts to focus again on Vice President Pence, brings John Eastman, the conservative lawyer, into the Oval Office and says, now it's your turn, Pence, to do what I want.
Amazing how many people he was trying to go to overturn this election and meddle with the results. Siobhan, another thing that I found striking about today's testimony was that we heard about 3 Republican congressmen seeking these blanket pardons. What did you make of that?
Well, I can tell you that I just interacted with one of those Republicans, Mo Brooks, and he said, yes, he did in fact seek a blanket pardon. It was on behalf of people who had formally objected to the results from Arizona and Pennsylvania, and it was based on the grounds that from his perspective, the Democrats would attempt to politicize their involvement should they ultimately remain in control. What I made of it, though, the big takeaway for me was that you're hearing this in large part from an aide to Mark Meadows, the former White House chief of staff, also former chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. And so this is somebody who would be deeply inside that knot of House Republicans. It shows the risk that a lot of information about what they were doing has been exposed to that select committee. And it's really an X marks the spot. The committee is telegraphing that there's more to see here.
And Bob, I want you to weigh in here as well. What did you make about the news of all of those seeking pardons?
I believe at last count, there were at least 5 House Republicans who were seeking pardons in the final days of the Trump presidency. And this is a really critical piece of information because we're continuing to learn about how so many lawmakers inside the Republican Party touched this episode in American democracy in a way we didn't previously understand until we heard this testimony under oath, often from Republican witnesses. Just a few days ago, we heard about Senator Ron Johnson passing on information about false electors to the vice president's staff, then Vice President Pence's staff. Now we're learning about the seeking of pardons by members of the House GOP. And this is not something that's just isolated in the past. The House Republican Conference is now poised, should they do well this fall, to hold power in Congress next year and to have enormous power. And the Senate Republicans the same, should they do well in the midterm elections this fall. So the people who are involved are still active, vital participants in our political scene, which makes this entire committee and what it's unveiling consequential, both constitutionally, legally, and politically.
That's a really good point, and especially how much we're learning, a year and a half after that Capitol attack and why it's so important. I mean, we also heard, of course, from Richard Donahue, who was then the acting Deputy Attorney General. He talked about then President Trump essentially wanting to clean house and install his own man as head of the Justice Department to do his bidding, essentially. Let's listen to what he had to say, how he described it.
Toward the end of the meeting, the president again was getting very agitated, and he said, people tell me I should just get rid of both of you. I should just remove you and make a change in leadership, put Jeff Clark in, maybe something will finally get done. And I responded, as I think I had earlier in the December 27th call, Mr. President, you should have the leadership that you want, but understand, the United States Justice Department functions on facts, evidence, and law, and those are not going to change. So you can have whatever leadership you want, but the department's position is not going to change.
So, Bob, Jeffrey Clark, of course, was not in the room today, but he was the key figure of today. Can you kind of remind us why he is so significant in all of this, particularly today?
Well, particularly today, because it was only yesterday, on Wednesday, that Mr. Clark's home was raided by federal investigators in Virginia. And he is now part of this investigation, not just at the congressional level, but at the Justice Department level. And he's a player now in what's happening at the DOJ. We know they were going after members of the Proud Boys and others for sedition charges. Now we're also learning there's a major front at the Justice Department investigating fake electors who participated in this scheme, who was involved. And Jeffrey Clark is someone who was pressuring Georgia. The governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, the legislature of Georgia wanted to send this letter, was working with President Trump to do that. He is now seeing his electronic devices, his documents being seized by federal investigators. So he was a key part of what was happening in early 2021, but he's also a key part of what's happening now with the Justice Department investigation of January 6th and related events.
Yeah, amazing news this morning. Siobhan, also, Jeffrey Clark was essentially going rogue. I mean, he went behind his colleague's back to go to the White House. Then Acting Attorney General Rosen talked a little bit about his interaction with Clark. Take a listen.
Unbeknownst to him, he was asked to go to a meeting, and he didn't know it, but it turned out it was at the Oval. He found himself at the Oval Office. And he was apologetic for that. And I said, well, you didn't tell me about it. It wasn't authorized. And you didn't even tell me after the fact. This is not appropriate.
So, Siobhan, I'm curious what you make of this. I mean, it was striking to hear from these Justice Department officials describing these actions that Clark was taking and the way that they were, describing him as this environmental lawyer guy, essentially.
We learned a couple of things today, too. Number one, how underhanded this was, because we heard, and we didn't see it, but we heard that Pat Cipollone, the former White House counsel, had testified that before that meeting, he told Jeffrey Clark it would not be a good idea to go into that meeting. It was basically a violation of policy, of code. And so it appears that Jeffrey Clark was not that forthright when he told Mr. Rosen that this meeting sort of was happenstance and he really had no idea it was going to be a problem. Number two, to bring it back full circle, let's also not forget that we know the person who introduced Jeffrey Clark to President Trump was Scott Perry, one of the lawmakers on that list of people allegedly seeking a pardon. Now, Mr. Perry has denied that. He's called that a soulless lie. But we're not only now in the realm of the Justice Department officials being in trouble, but you can see the microscope honing closer and closer in on this group of House Republicans, particularly the ones who were in that White House meeting on December 21st, the House Freedom Caucus folks with President Trump, where after that meeting, Scott Perry did have that formal introduction to the president.
And Bob, I want to play a little more from Donahue because he had some striking testimony later on in the hearing. Take a listen.
I thought it was useful to point out to the president that Jeff Clark simply didn't have the skills, the ability, and the experience to run the department. And so I said, Mr. President, you're talking about putting a man in that seat who has never tried a criminal case, who's never conducted a criminal investigation. He's telling you that he's going to take charge of the department, 115,000 employees, including the entire FBI, and turn the place on a dime and conduct nationwide criminal investigations that will produce results in a matter of days. It's impossible, it's absurd, it's not going to happen, and it's going to fail.
So, Bob, how surprising is this in light of so many revelations today?
It's not surprising in the terms of understanding former President Trump's conduct over the course of his presidency, testing the bounds of presidential power. But it's surprising that the United States came to this moment where it was almost a repeat of history of what happened during Watergate when President Richard Nixon was so frustrated with the special prosecutor, they had what we now call the Saturday Night Massacre, where he rifled through and different Department of Justice officials to try to make sure that special prosecutor got fired. And now we're seeing, decades later, another testing of American democracy, but specifically of the Justice Department, by someone who holds the enormous power of the presidency in his hands.
Especially 50 years after Watergate. That's a good note to end on. Robert Costa and Siobhan Hughes, thank you so much for your reporting on this big news day. And we have more hearings to come next month. Appreciate your time. A handful of top Justice Department officials telling the House Select Committee that they were on the verge of resigning en masse if former President Trump tried to force ally Jeffrey Clark to the top of the agency. You're streaming Red and Blue.
There were isolated instances of fraud. None of them came close to calling into question the outcome of the election in any individual state.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow!
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's gonna bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
This week on 60 Minutes,
That's incredible.
The 60 Minutes.
60 minutes, 60 minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
you know how this sounds.
What's your response to that?
60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail. We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun. But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking.
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
Innovative and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
The department to insert itself into the political process this way, I think would have had grave consequences for the country. It may very well have spiraled us into a constitutional crisis. And I wanted to make sure that he understood the gravity of the situation because he didn't seem to really appreciate it.
That was former acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue responding to a draft letter written by former Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Clark. The letter was to be sent to Georgia state officials and claimed the Department of Justice had evidence of voter fraud. CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge joins me now. Hey, Catherine, great to see you. Thanks so much for being here. So you've been covering the Justice Department for 2 decades. What was happening inside the department around January 6th?
Well, Caitlin, one of my contacts who was working in the department at that time told me that the atmospherics, that the department, the system felt extremely stressed, and they likened it to living and working on a knife's edge. And they said that the January 3rd meeting, where there was this showdown between the two sides over whether the Justice Department intervened, should have just lasted a few minutes, but remarkably, as we learned today, went on for several hours with central democratic principles hanging in the balance, Caitlin.
Yeah, Catherine, I want to ask you about that because we talk so much about January 6th, but January 3rd was such a pivotal day. Can you kind of take us back into the Oval Office? What did we learn today from this testimony about what was actually happening in that longer than expected meeting?
Well, Caitlin, based on the testimony today and previous depositions, I'll set the scene for everyone at home. Late in the afternoon on January 3rd, they were called to the Oval Office. President Trump was sitting behind that wooden Resolute desk, and he had the top Justice Department officials, not only from the Justice Department, but also his White House legal team, and he invited them to debate the pros and cons of the Justice Department interfering in the presidential election outcome. Really, the majority, by any stretch of the imagination, as we learned today, was adamantly against any intervention by the Justice Department on the basis that it was not supported by the facts or by the law. And one of the witnesses testified that he said to President Trump, if you proceed with this, if you take Jeffrey Clark and you make him the acting attorney general, you will do tremendous damage to the country, tremendous damage to the department, and significantly tremendous damage to yourself, because all of us will resign en masse. And that may have been the tipping point for President Trump, who ultimately rejected this plan for the intervention at the state level.
Incredible to think how close they came to that, however. As we heard, Clark was the author of this draft letter written to electors in Georgia. How strong was the resistance to actually going ahead and sending this among Trump's legal team?
Everyone that I've spoken to who is connected to this testimony says that there was never a chance that Jeffrey Clark would become the acting attorney general, and there was never a chance the letter would be sent. But what was so concerning to them is that though they told the individuals involved that based on the law and based on the facts, they had not found evidence or widespread evidence of voter fraud, it still continued to proceed. It's a little bit like a scenario, if you will, when you ask one parent for something and they turn you down, and then you turn to the next one. I'm not trying to minimize it, but it kind of had that sort of jockeying feel. But what was most concerning to them is that every time they felt that they had shut down one avenue that the president and his team wanted to explore, another one would pop up, and they'd have to then deal with that as well. But they told me they were not fearful in that meeting that somehow this plan would go ahead, because they were all united in this position that they would leave the department. They would essentially sort of decapitate the leadership of the department, and others would follow. And this would be such a stain on the president and his legacy that they felt that would be enough to stop this. And in the end, it did.
Yeah, Catherine, I had a similar reaction. How many avenues the then president, was trying to go down to get the answer that he wanted. I know you've been reporting on the just massive scale of this criminal investigation, and you're reporting that this is going to get even larger. How so?
Well, based on what we learned today here at CBS News and confirmed independently, this investigation into whether you call it the fake electors or the Trump electors has expanded. We knew in January of this year through the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco that federal prosecutors were reviewing the matter, and we've had confirmation that Jeffrey Clark, this is the individual who was putting forward this idea, his house was raided by, according to his spokesman, about a dozen law enforcement officials, and they also seized his electronic devices. They're calling this government overreach or the weaponization of government authorities. Couple that, though, with the issuance of subpoenas to a number of parties that the New York Times, and we're working to confirm, it says 9 individuals in at least 4 states. So that tells you that it is expanding. And the question is, where will they ultimately land on the charges in this particular case?
An expanding investigation, and a year and a half later, we're still learning more and new information. Catherine Herridge, as always, thank you for your time and reporting.
You're welcome, Caitlin.
And for more legal analysis behind today's hearings, let's bring in Jessica Levinson. She's a CBS News legal contributor and a Loyola Law School professor. Hey, Jessica, thanks so much for being here. So because you're a professor, I kind of want to do a little bit of a civics lesson here. The Justice Department is part of the federal government, of course, but it's meant to be apolitical on some level. And we kind of heard Kinzinger, the Republican member of the committee, kind of frame this hearing about how the Justice Department is supposed to be politically independent. At the same time, however, it's staffed with, a lot of political appointees. So kind of how did you see that play out in today's hearing?
Well, I think we saw it play out actually in important ways. And this is one of the things I'm so glad that you highlighted, which is the Department of Justice is not the president's personal legal counsel, and it should not be subject to the president's desires and personal predilections. The Department of Justice serves the American people. Let's emphasize the name, Department of Justice. They administer the law, they enforce federal law, and I think that's part of the reason why they were able to stand up to the president who wanted them to essentially carry their water. There's a whole host of reasons why we want that Department of Justice to be free from political pressure. And in fact, right now, I think there are a lot of Democrats or more liberal people who are wishing the Department of Justice would indict the former president, who are hoping they'll hear these committee hearings and say, of course, we're going to go forward with criminal indictments here. But we want them to look at the facts, look at the law, make a determination as to whether or not they can show that there has been a federal criminal violation beyond a reasonable doubt. That's their job, not to say to the president, of course, we'll go ahead and succumb to your wishes. Now, how do you make that balancing test, or how do you balance that when you have career members of the Department of Justice and then some appointed members? I would say we do that in a lot of different departments on the state, local, and federal level. And because even when people are politically appointed, the understanding and idea is they still know the agency they're working for. They still know that this is supposed to be an independent agency.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I think we heard that from Donahue and Rosen today, essentially saying that, they do not serve, they serve at the pleasure of the president, of course, but serve to carry out the law here. And I just think it's important to kind of have that frame. We heard, from these Justice Department officials who were basically telling the former president, or the then president, I should say, look, if you put Jeffrey Clark at the top of DOJ, we're all walking out. We're all quitting. We're all resigning. Can you kind of talk to us about the significance of this and how that could have played out?
Well, I think it really would have been quite a frightening scenario to have the Department of Justice be led by someone not only who doesn't have the experience, who probably is not competent, frankly, to lead a department that is that big with that many moving parts and that many different litigation arms, policy arms, but the idea that you would have the department led by somebody who is propagating conspiracies, who is potentially willing to move forward with illegal actions, maybe opening up a sham investigation into the election so that the president can say, look, the Department of Justice is investigating the election. Now, why did people threaten to quit? It seems to me, based on the testimony, that
And I believe we have lost Jessica's audio.
Sorry, was there an audio
she's
problem?
Back. Yes, you are back.
Oh, so I was saying that I think the only way that they could prove their point to the president that you cannot do this is to threaten that they actually would resign. Not to say you can't do this, but to say we will leave if you do this.
And, you know, we've been hearing from so many lawyers and attorneys over the past couple of weeks watching these hearings. Can you kind of explain, you know, what's the difference between White House counsel, the president's counsel? Can you kind of explain the difference between these different kinds of lawyers that we've been hearing through this testimony?
So super briefly, kind of 30,000-foot view, what we have is, again, the Department of Justice really serving the American people, enforcing and administering federal law. Then we have the White House counsel that, again, is not the president's personal attorney. The White House counsel is there to advise the office of the president and to protect the office of the president. That's different from what is personally helpful to Donald Trump. That person is really charged with what is the right decision for whoever is in the Oval Office. And then, of course, we have the president's personal counsel. We have people like Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, and we can see how they took very different tacks. At times, there's been kind of question as to whether or not they actually are representing the president or whether they were just on their own wanting to support the president. But they took very different tacks here, filing suits in federal court, which they're now subject to legal sanctions for. But again, very different roles. Department of Justice for the American people, Office of Legal Counsel, and, White House counsel for the inhabitant of the Oval Office. And then we have the president's personal attorney for the president.
And something that was really striking to hear today was that a number of Republican congressmen had asked the White House for pardons after the riot, especially Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. What's the legal basis behind seeking these pardons, and would it have been realistic in your eyes? I mean, it seemed like they were asking for these blanket pardons.
So I want to caution a couple of things. One, accepting a pardon is not necessarily an admission of guilt. Asking for a pardon is not necessarily an admission of guilt. You could claim that asking for a pardon just shows you're worried about being federally criminally prosecuted, but you might think, for instance, that Biden's Department of Justice would be politically motivated. So I think their defense would be, well, we were worried about a witch hunt where the Department of Justice under Biden is just going after us for no reason, and it doesn't show we think we broke the law. Now, that might not be the best explanation, but I do think we need to be careful about saying you asked for a pardon, therefore you know you're guilty. Now, it is possible to ask for prospective pardons, to ask for broad pardons. This is a power that under the federal Constitution is given only to the president, and there are very, very few limits on it, as we've talked about over the last number of years. So just a word of being a little more tempered about, oh, if they asked for it, it shows they knew. They know that they're guilty.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction, especially since that's what we've been hearing from some members of Congress. Jessica Levinson, thank you so much for your time as always and for that civics lesson. I think we all need a little reminder of who these people are and why this is all important. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And the Supreme Court is citing federal authority over a state law related to a person's right to carry a gun. Why the ruling has the potential for more Americans, giving them the right to legally carry weapons on the streets of the nation's largest cities. You're streaming Red and Blue.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow!
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's gonna bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
This week on 60 Minutes.
That's incredible.
The 60 Minutes.
60 minutes, 60 minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
You know how this sounds.
What's your response to that?
60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel. Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy.
And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun. But wait,
There's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
We found it.
You're kidding me!
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
The Supreme Court has struck down a century-old New York State gun law. The law required prospective gun owners to give proper cause for why they wanted to carry a handgun in public. The justices ruled 6-3 that it was unconstitutional. CBS News' Skylar Henry has more.
In what's being described as a major expansion of gun rights, the Supreme Court struck down a New York law that required a person to show a special need in order to get a permit to carry a gun in public.
I think it's very important, not just for New York, but for how other gun laws are going to be evaluated as well.
In the 6-3 conservative majority opinion, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote, the Second and 14th Amendments protect an individual's right to carry a handgun for self-defense outside the home.
My reaction is relief. And happiness that the lawful and legal gun owner of New York State is no longer going to be persecuted by laws that have nothing to do with the safety of the people.
The High Court's ruling comes as Congress works on new gun control legislation following a string of mass shootings and a spike in gun violence across the country.
Shocking. Absolutely shocking.
New York elected officials vowed not to give up.
We do not need people entering our subways, our restaurants, our movie theaters with concealed weapons. We don't need more guns on our streets.
We cannot allow New York to become the Wild Wild West.
The ruling is expected to impact similar laws in several states, including California and Massachusetts. Skylar Henry, CBS News, the Supreme Court.
And Jeffrey Rosen joins me now. He's a CBS News constitutional law expert and a professor of law at George Washington University and the CEO of the National Constitution Center. And I want to make clear that you are not the Jeff Rosen that we heard from during testimony today, who, of course, was the former acting attorney general testifying in front of the January 6th committee. So another Jeff Rosen here to talk about the constitutionality of these gun laws. So, Jeff, I just kind of want to get your immediate reaction to this ruling from the Supreme Court today. Is it what you expected?
Well, the outcome was expected. After the oral argument, it was pretty clear that the court would declare an individual right to carry a handgun outside the home for self-defense and would strike down the New York law. What was more surprising was the very robust constitutional methodology that 6 justices, led by Justice Thomas, adopted. Justice Thomas has long said that the Second Amendment shouldn't be a second-class right. And for the first time, he said judges shouldn't balance the need for gun laws against the individual right to bear arms, but instead should look exclusively to history. So there were dramatic debates about meanings of laws passed in 1348, and the liberals basically said the conservatives are cherry-picking the history to reach the results they want, and that this will call into question a whole bunch of gun laws across the country.
Yeah, I want to get to that a little bit later about kind of how this will impact some of these state laws. And earlier today, Vice President Kamala Harris reacted to the Supreme Court's decision, and she noted these recent mass shootings, of course, that we've seen in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas. Take a listen.
I was in Buffalo. I attended one of the funerals. We have seen the massacre of 19 babies and their teachers in Uvalde. We can go on down the list about why it yet again is on the front pages, so to speak, of the concern of the American people about what.
So we've been covering all week the bipartisan negotiations over federal gun legislation, but I'm curious what this kind of decision has in terms of impacting the debates around guns. I mean, do you think lawmakers will feel like any significant restrictions on gun ownership that they implement could ultimately be ending up, being struck down by the Supreme Court?
Well, it may well affect the debate. The court stressed, as it had in an earlier case, that nothing in the opinion should cast doubt on longstanding prohibitions, and then they gave a bunch of examples: the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places like schools and government buildings, and then they said, or laws imposing conditions on the commercial sale of arms. So that means that the things that Congress is debating, like background checks, are constitutionally fine. I don't think anyone's questioning those. But there are a bunch of other regulations that might be called into question by this ruling, including, for example, bans on assault weapons, which Congress may not pass, but some states have those bans. And it's not clear from this opinion whether or not assault weapons bans would be okay or not. And the uncertainty that the opinion introduces will absolutely affect the legislative debate.
And we were all, on these days that we know Supreme Court decisions are coming down, we're frantically refreshing our screens and waiting to see whether the ruling on abortion will come down. I'm curious kind of whether and how these two might be related. I mean, do you see any sort of connection in the court ruling to assert federal protections for the Second Amendment, while at the same time considering punting federal protections for abortion from a federal level down to a state level?
Well, liberals will certainly criticize the decision for exactly that reason. They'll say it's not consistent for the court to defer to Democratic legislatures in the case of abortion, but to tie the hands of legislatures in the case of gun control. Conservatives will respond that the Second Amendment explicitly protects the right to keep and bear arms, but the right to abortion is not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. But the common thread in both of these decisions, if the court does overturn Roe, is this new emphasis on constitutional history. And there's an awful lot of debate about what the framers thought. And this means that it will be harder to update the Constitution in accord with changing times.
And President Biden, in reaction to this ruling today, has been essentially calling on states to pass new gun laws. Can you kind of help us understand, are there going to be some kind of problems for different states having vastly different rules around guns when they could potentially be at odds with federal law?
Well, this decision may bring state gun laws into harmony because Justices Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts stressed that the 43 states that have permits on the books that basically are called shall issue regimes, which means that you get a concealed carry permit as long as you meet certain criteria. Those are fine. It's 6 states, New York, Hawaii, California, and a few others, that have this so-called may issue regime where you have to show a special cause or proper reason to get a gun. And those 6 states are going to have to now put their laws into harmony with the 43 states that have the more carefully regulated regime. And that could bring some national uniformity. But Justice Breyer, in his dissenting opinion, said, well, that's a problem because different states may have different levels of population density. New York might have different needs than Wyoming. And for a variety of reasons, he thinks that states should be willing to tolerate different degrees of risks and choose to balance the competing benefits and dangers of firearms differently.
And I mentioned this bipartisan gun deal. It actually passed the biggest, hurdle, the filibuster today, getting support from about a dozen Republicans. It's increasingly likely to pass and get to the president's desk soon. And of course, this would be the first, major piece of federal legislation that we've seen on guns in 30 years. But it is fairly limited in scope and by design. Does this set up so that the states are effectively the ones who will essentially have the last word on gun issues?
Yes, as you say, the fact that Congress is not able to pass anything other than really modest regulations like expanded background checks means that the states will have the last word. But this judicial decision says the state's last word is much more limited now than it was before this decision came down. And there's going to be huge litigation, both on new regulations the states could pass, like assault weapons bans, but also existing regulations that have been on the books for 100 years. This New York law was originally passed in 1903. And there are a whole bunch of other regulations that had been unquestioned before today that will now be litigated. And all this means is that judges are going to be very busy in Second Amendment cases moving forward.
Certainly a lot more lawsuits to come. Jeffrey Rosen, the other Jeffrey Rosen, we should say. Thank you so much for your time and your analysis. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we are going to take a quick break, but we'll be back. You're streaming Red and Blue on CBS News.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy.
And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big.
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars. Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow.
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's gonna bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
This week on 60 Minutes.
That's incredible.
The 60 minutes.
60 minutes, 60 minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
You know how this sounds.
What's your response to that?
60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
Documentary filmmaker Alex Holder had access to President Trump and his family in the days before and after the January 6th insurrection. He sat down with CBS News anchor and managing editor Norah O'Donnell in his first television interview since his deposition with the House committee investigating the attack. Here's part of their conversation.
You interviewed the president twice after January 6th. Did he express any remorse?
I think that people will have to wait to see and find out the answer to that question. I promise I'm not trying to be cute. I just genuinely feel that people might have a different impression about his reaction than I might have.
What was staggering about what the former president said after January 6th?
I think what was staggering was that he essentially gave the reason why they were there without fully understanding that he was responsible for that reason.
You seem to be suggesting that even afterwards, he doesn't accept any responsibility.
I think that would be a fair conclusion to what I just said, yes.
And we're going to take a quick break, which means you have a couple of minutes to download the free CBS News app on all your devices. You can catch live local coverage from across the country from all of our CBS stations. And while you're at it, check out Paramount Plus. We've got a mountain of content there for you to stream as well, including your favorite shows, movies, and sports.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like. Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
The Fifth House Select Committee hearing on January 6th focused on former President Trump's effort to influence the Justice Department over the 2020 election results. I spoke to Democratic Congressman Pete Aguilar, who serves on that committee, about his takeaways from today. So first, Congressman, what has struck me so much about these hearings is the way in which you all are relying on conservative voices, Republicans. I remember when you were leading the questioning, you even handed it off to a Republican attorney. What is the significance of that?
Well, the significance is that these are folks who were sitting in the witness chairs today who were Republican appointees to the Trump administration, to the Department of Justice, but they had their limits and they were guided by the Constitution and the oath that they took. In our hearing, we had the Vice President's general counsel as well as a former conservative jurist, and you're right, I did hand it off to a former United States Attorney, John Wood as well. These are folks who can help us have these conversations, get to the truth. That's all we've ever wanted, and that's our charge, our mandate, our responsibility is to get to the truth. And I'm so pleased with the staff that we have, as well as the compelling witnesses that we heard today and that we have heard over the last few weeks.
And Congressman, a lot of conservatives have been saying, look, this is proof that the system worked, that the backstops were essentially held. Then why have these hearings?
Well, we're having these hearings because this is the only time since the War of 1812 that we have had a violent assault on the United States Capitol. And this was a federal judge who indicated earlier in the year that this was a coup in search of a legal theory. So that's why we're having these hearings. The importance is, just like Adam Kinzinger said today, though, have we done enough to make sure that this can't happen again? Or will a president just install loyalists who will do exactly what he says? Just like Jeffrey Clark tried to do, is to try to be installed and to try to tell the president anything he would hear in order to hold that top spot. And as Adam Kinzinger laid out today very well, has enough changed was a question that he asked. It's an important question.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really striking to hear how close all of these officials came to resigning and kind of how much it was really hanging by a thread there. You mentioned Jeffrey Clark, and he was obviously the focus of today's hearings. He has pleaded the Fifth over and over and over again. He had his house raided earlier today by the FBI. Listening to the testimony from these DOJ officials today about Clark's actions, how worrisome do you find them, these actions trying to essentially help former President Trump circumvent the election?
Well, he was clearly at the center of this effort. From the Department of Justice perspective, Jeffrey Clark was there at every step of the way in the 10 days leading up to January 6th. As the doors kept shutting on the legal side of the president's challenges to the election results, Jeffrey Clark was there supporting every conspiracy theory at the Department of Justice, indicating that they can and should do more, even though that was a violation of the department rules as well as a violation of the oath that he took to the Constitution. So I think it's very fair to say that his actions were at the center of a lot of these efforts. But clearly, what we have laid out is that time and time again, the president himself was at the center of a lot of these decisions and actions as well.
Yeah, and Congressman, your colleague Jamie Raskin had told reporters yesterday that there's, quote, a deluge of new evidence since the Select Committee began its work. Can you kind of characterize some of that evidence and kind of walk us through how you're sorting it all out?
Well, thankfully, we have a capable team and staff who are helping us with this, but I'm not going to characterize the types of information that we've received, but there is more information than when we started these hearings, partially because the chairman himself asked for individuals to come forward with information that they know, and he ended a couple hearings by giving the tip line as well. But public reporting indicated that the documentarian as well that has surfaced has information that is relevant to our inquiry. So things like that are the types of information that are helpful, and we're going to chase every lead and do everything we can to continue to tell this story in a truthful, fair, and honest way. And that's exactly what you saw here in episode 5.
Yeah, and Congressman, another thing that we learned today was, how many Republican members of Congress, your colleagues, had asked for kind of blanket pardons. I mean, that suggests that they knew they were doing something wrong. Matt Gaetz, for example, who from Florida, of course, is a staunch supporter of former President Trump, asked for a pardon. Can you tell us anything about why a current member of Congress may have asked for such a thing? And I know you have tried to have them comply with subpoenas for the committee. What are kind of the next steps for that? Do you need to hear from them?
Well, we've asked to hear from them, and I would think anybody who was guided by the Constitution and our laws would come forward, not only if they have information that is helpful, but if they received a lawful subpoena. We haven't heard from our colleagues. They have not come before us without conditions, and so we're going to continue to press for the truth. But I think it is alarming. I'll let the public decide for themselves why someone would seek a pardon in the throes of the end of an administration after the failed coup attempt. But what I will say is that clearly the evidence that was presented shows that multiple members sought pardons.
And Congresswoman Liz Cheney has said at the end of the hearings that she wants Pat Cipollone to come and testify. We heard a lot about what he was doing from his colleagues today. Do you still need his testimony, or do you think what you have so far is sufficient?
Well, I'm always going to err to the side of having more testimony and more depositions and transcribed interviews. We've had over 1,000 so far interviews to date, but clearly the White House counsel, as Adam Kinzinger, my colleague, laid out today, had a lot of thoughts and played a role in these discussions. And so, we'd obviously, love to hear more.
Congressman, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you so much.
That does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And a reminder, if you want to watch previous episodes of the program, you can see them anytime on the CBS News website. Just head to cbsnews.com/redandblue.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars. Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost